In our last lecture, we discussed the four types of consequences that can follow operant behaviors. In this lecture, we're going to focus on one of those four types of consequences, positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement can be classified in lots of different ways. One of those ways is immediate versus delayed. The more immediate the reinforcer, the stronger its effect on behavior. So in order to increase or strengthen a behavior, you want to have that positive reinforcer come as soon as possible after the behavior is displayed. If there is a long delay between having the behavior displayed and the reinforcer, it's going to have a very weak effect on the behavior. It's not going to be very effective at strengthening or increasing that behavior if there's a long delay before the reinforcer is delivered. That's why people struggle with things like exercise. If you could exercise today and have muscles or be toned tomorrow, of course you'd exercise. Of course, it would increase that behavior. But because you have to exercise for weeks or months to see the reinforcer for your behavior, it tends to not function very well to increase that behavior. So psychologists argue that behaviors that are strengthened by long delayed reinforcers are under the control of rules or instructions. So they say that behaviors that are strengthened by reinforcers that come a long time after the behavior, they function differently than behaviors that are strengthened by immediate reinforcers. And they say that behaviors that are strengthened by long delayed reinforcers are really under the control of rules or instructions. And what that means is you have to have knowledge of additional rules in order to be reinforced by a reinforcer that comes long after the behavior. So for example, if you tell your friend a joke and your friend immediately laughs, you quickly understand that your friend is laughing as a result of your joke and that laugh will serve to reinforce your joke telling. With things like grades, there is a long delay, so you have to understand that rules govern that process. So if you study hard for an exam and then weeks later you go on Blackboard and see the grade of A, you have to understand the rule that this grade of A is the reinforcer for the behavior of studying that I showed weeks ago. It's not very clear unless you understand the rules that govern that behavior. If you go to work every day for a month, and then after that month, you see money show up in your bank account through direct deposit, you have to understand the rule that this money in my bank account is the reinforcer for that month's worth of work that I did. So that type of long delayed reinforcer tends to function differently in our minds than the immediate reinforcer. So if you want to be sure that you strengthen or increase the behavior, you want to make sure that the positive reinforcement is close in time to the behavior that you're trying to increase. You want it to be immediate. Positive reinforcers can also be classified as primary or secondary. Primary reinforcers are also referred to as unconditioned reinforcers. And if you remember, unconditioned means unlearned. So these primary or unconditioned reinforcers are events that are innately reinforcing, meaning that we're born finding these events reinforcing. We don't have to learn to be reinforced by these events. And these are events that satisfy inborn needs. So these are things like food, water, proper temperature, sex, physical comfort. These are things that you don't have to learn to be reinforced by. You're just automatically, naturally reinforced by these types of reinforcers. In contrast, secondary or conditioned reinforcers have to be learned. We have to learn to be reinforced by these things. So these are events that are reinforcing because they have been associated with some other reinforcer. So things like good grades, they are not innately reinforcing. They are not naturally reinforcing. The reason that you are reinforced by good grades is because you associate good grades with other things. So you associate grades with doing a good job and earning money so you can provide for yourself. You associate good grades with the respect of your peers or your parents. Good grades themselves are not reinforcing, but good grades are reinforcing because they're associated with other things. Money is a secondary reinforcer. Money on its own is not reinforcing. You give a baby money, they have no reaction to it, it has no meaning to them, they're not reinforced by it. As opposed to you give a baby food without any learning, the baby finds the food reinforcing. Money, you have to learn that it's reinforcing because you associate it with other things. Again, you associate money with being able to buy clothing, being able to buy food. You associate it with respect and admiration from your peers or from other people. So you have to learn to be reinforced by money because you associate it with other things. The same thing goes for gold stars. Um, a token to trade in to get some type of prize. They only have value, they're only reinforcing because they are associated with something else. Generalized reinforcers are a specific type of secondary reinforcer. So a generalized reinforcer is a secondary reinforcer that has been associated with several other reinforcers. So an example of a generalized reinforcer would be money. Money is not reinforcing because it's associated with one particular reinforcer. It's associated with lots of different reinforcers. So like we said, money can buy you clothes, it can earn you respect, it can buy you food, it can allow you freedom, it can allow you to travel, it can get you lots of different things. It's been associated with lots of different reinforcers, so it's generalized. Attention, especially for young children, is a generalized reinforcer. They can associate attention with being fed by a parent, comforted by a parent. They can associate it with respect or love from the parent. And so attention is a generalized reinforcer because it's associated with lots of different reinforcers. And the thing about generalized reinforcers is they can become reinforcing in and of themselves. So, for example, some people prefer to have money over the things that money can buy them. Money has become so reinforcing to them that it's reinforcing on its own, even more so than the things that they've associated with money, more reinforcing than the clothing or the food or whatever they can buy with the money. Attention can become its own reinforcer for young children, or for anybody actually. Reinforcers can also be classified as intrinsic or extrinsic. With intrinsic reinforcement, reinforcement is provided by the mere act of performing the behavior. So this means that there is no outside reinforcement provided for performing this behavior. You perform the behavior because you find just the act of performing the behavior to be reinforcing. So for example, if you read for enjoyment, you're not reading because reading gains you anything. You read it because you enjoy performing that behavior. You might ride your bike purely because you enjoy it. So again, the reinforcement is intrinsic. It comes purely from the act of performing that behavior. You find that act to be pleasurable. So in contrast, extrinsic reinforcement. In extrinsic reinforcement, the reinforcement is provided by the consequence of the behavior that is external to the behavior. So the reinforcement does not come from the act of performing the behavior itself. The reinforcement comes from the external consequence of performing that behavior. So in contrast to the intrinsic reinforcement of reading for enjoyment, extrinsic reinforcement might come from reading to earn an A on an exam. Or if you have these, book clubs where a student might receive some type of, you know, coupon for a pizza restaurant if you read 20 books over the summer, that will be an example of extrinsic reinforcement. So there is something outside of the behavior that reinforces the behavior. If you go to work not because you enjoy your work, if that's not what's maintaining the behavior, if you go to work because you get a paycheck, that's extrinsic reinforcement. If you dance not for the love of dance, but because it gets you attention from your peers, that will be extrinsic reinforcement. So for a while, the thinking has been that if somebody finds something to be intrinsically reinforcing and provide them with extrinsic reinforcement, that they will lose their intrinsic reinforcement. So an example of that would be, a lot of times you will have, let's say, athletes who play the game for the love of the game. So, you have somebody that plays football purely because they love football. They're not getting anything out of it other than they just enjoy playing that sport. Then they become a professional and they're getting paid for it. Now they have extrinsic reinforcement for this behavior. And sometimes you'll hear people say, or hear that athlete say, I lost my love for the game. Once I started getting paid for it, I lost my intrinsic reinforcement. I no longer do it because I enjoy it. I'm doing it for the money. So the thinking was that if somebody is intrinsically reinforced by something, you don't want to give them the extrinsic reinforcement because they'll lose that intrinsic reinforcement. So if your child likes to read because they enjoy reading, you don't want to then pay them to read because they'll lose that love of reading and they'll then just be reading because they're getting paid for it. So that was the way that psychologists thought about intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcement for quite a while. But more recent research has shown that that is not always the case. So external reinforcement tends to undermine or decrease intrinsic reinforcement when, number one, the person is instructed beforehand that they will get a reward. So if you tell somebody before they perform a behavior that they're going to get rewarded for it, they tend to lose their intrinsic reinforcement associated with that activity. So they know, hey, I'm doing this, I'm reading this book because I'm going to get paid. If they don't know they're going to be reinforced for it and they get it afterwards, the reinforcement is not what's driving the behavior. They're reading because they enjoy reading, and then unexpectedly they get some type of reward after the fact. So it doesn't take away their intrinsic reinforcement because they didn't know they were going to get reinforced afterward. The other time that external or extrinsic reinforcement will decrease intrinsic reinforcement is when the reward is tangible, something the person can actually touch and see. So things like money, things like a trophy, things like some type of actual physical reward can decrease that intrinsic motivation. Things that are not tangible, things like praise, like respect, like admiration, those things don't tend to decrease the intrinsic reinforcement associated with an activity. And finally, extrinsic reinforcement can decrease intrinsic reinforcement when the reward is given simply for performing the activity. So those are things like participation trophies. If you give somebody a reward simply for doing the activity, regardless of how well they do the activity, that does tend to decrease their internal or intrinsic reinforcement for the behavior. Now, if you give them a reward or a reinforcer for how they perform it, for performing it well, it doesn't tend to decrease that intrinsic reinforcement. So if you are a highly skilled, outstanding dancer and you receive a trophy for that, that doesn't take away your love of dance in the same way that it would if you say, hey, I'm giving you this trophy simply for showing up and doing the dance. So it devalues or takes away that intrinsic reinforcement associated with the behavior. Reinforcers can also be natural or contrived. Natural reinforcers are reinforcers that are typically provided for a certain behavior. These are the reinforcers that are expected for that behavior in a particular setting. So, for example, the natural consequence of brushing your teeth is having nice white teeth. It's just something that naturally follows the behavior. It's a natural, expected consequence of that behavior. Being kind to others, the consequence or the natural consequence of that is being well liked. If you're kind to other people, people will like you. It's what just naturally, automatically follows from the behavior. As opposed to contrived or artificial reinforcers, these are reinforcers that have been deliberately arranged to modify a behavior. So examples of this would be things like praising your child for brushing their teeth. This is something a parent has deliberately arranged to try to increase their child's behavior of brushing their teeth. So it's not something that naturally follows. You deliberately say, I'm going to praise my child when they brush their teeth. I'm going to deliberately give them extra TV time when they brush their teeth without being asked. So this is an artificial reinforcer. Giving your child candy for being kind to others would be a contrived or artificial reinforcer. It's not the expected, just natural, automatic consequence of that behavior. It's something somebody deliberately sets up to try to change that behavior. Typically, natural reinforcers are much more effective than contrived or artificial reinforcers. So allowing just the natural consequences of the behavior to kind of develop tends to influence the behavior more than contrived reinforcers. So now this particular example is the example of a punisher, but the same thing applies for reinforcers. When I think about natural versus contrived, I always think about children. My children also, my husband has a story about this. Um, One time his mom was telling him, not to borrow his neighbor's bicycle because the bicycle was too big. My son would always sneak and borrow the neighbor's bicycle until one time he got in an accident, like ran into a wall and injured himself. After his mom found out that he was okay, she said, "Now I bet you won't ride that bike again." And he didn't ride the bike again. So all those times of her telling him not to ride the bike, punishing him for riding the bike, didn't change his behavior until he experienced a natural consequence of falling off the bike during himself. Then he stopped the behavior. With my own children, I'll tell them, don't stand on that, don't do this, better stop doing this, and they won't stop. And so eventually I have to say, okay, I've asked you not to do this, I've told you not to do this. If you hurt yourself, then I'll guess you learn, because I've tried to stop you and you are not responding to me telling you not to do this. And so of course, you don't want to set your children up to be hurt, but sometimes people have to experience the natural consequences, whether they be rewards or punishers. They have to experience the natural consequences of their behavior in order to change that behavior. And finally, let's talk about shaping. Now, one of the difficult things about operant conditioning is the person, the organism, has to display the behavior. They have to exhibit the behavior before you can reinforce or punish the behavior. So if you want to increase your child's behavior of getting A's, the child has to get A's first in order for you to reinforce that behavior. You can't reinforce a behavior that is not occurring. So that brings a question of, how do you make a behavior happen so that you can increase it through reinforcement? So how do you strengthen the behavior if the person is not even showing that behavior at all? And the answer to that is through shaping. And shaping is the gradual creation of a new operant behavior through reinforcement of successive approximations of that behavior. And so another way to state this is step-by-step reinforcement until the goal behavior is reached. So you see examples of this all the time with animal training. So, animal trainer wants an animal to perform some type of intricate trick. Of course, the animal is not naturally showing this behavior, so you have to reinforce each step of that behavior. So first you teach them the first step of the trick. You reinforce that. Then you string that together and do the first two steps of the trick. Reinforce that. So you're reinforcing each step until you get to the ultimate goal behavior of this complicated trick. If you had waited for the animal to show the whole trick, you would never get to the point where you could reinforce the behavior. But by shaping or reinforcing each step along the way, you can ultimately get to that goal behavior you're trying to see. With children, you see this a lot. You can't wait until your child shows a perfect behavior to reinforce it. You have to reinforce each step. So think about teaching a child to walk. First, the child scoots along the ground, and you praise them, and you're so excited because they're scooting. Then the child stands up. You praise that behavior. You reinforce that behavior. Then the child might stand up and pull itself along, furniture by holding onto the furniture, and you praise that. Then the child might take one wobbly step and fall down. You praise that behavior until they're taking a few steps, and you finally getting the goal behavior that you hope to see, and you praise them for reaching that final goal of walking independently. So shaping allows you to create behaviors that are not being shown by sort of gradually, step-by-step reinforcing those small attempts at the behavior until you ultimately get to the behavior that you're trying to increase in that person or organism.